High in the mountains of Ethiopia, behind monastery walls and centuries of incense, there survived a book once known across the ancient Jewish world, quoted in the New Testament, copied beside other sacred writings, and yet left out of most Bibles used today. Its name is 1st Enoch, and the tension at the heart of its story is not simple suppression, but something stranger: how a text could be treasured, transmitted, and debated for centuries, and still never become scripture for most Christians. Online, this is often called the book that was removed from the Bible, but that phrase hides a more complicated story. 1st Enoch was not part of the Jewish Hebrew Bible as it came down through rabbinic tradition. It was not received into most Catholic or Protestant canons, and yet it was deeply influential in parts of ancient Judaism known to early Christians and preserved in full by the Ethiopian Orthodox tradition. So the real question is not whether someone simply took it out. The better question is this: how did one of the most important ancient religious books outside the Bible survive in Ethiopia, echo in the New Testament, and still remain outside most canons? To understand 1st Enoch, we have to step into the centuries before Christ. Most scholars date the major sections of the book between roughly the 3rd century BC and the 1st century BC. This was the age of the Hellenistic kingdoms after Alexander the Great. Judea stood between empires. The Ptolemies ruled from Egypt, the Seleucids pressed from Syria, and Jewish writers were wrestling with evil, empire, judgment, angels, and the fate of the righteous. The figure at the center of the book is Enoch, the ancient patriarch from Genesis, the one of whom Scripture says, "Enoch walked with God, then he was no more, because God took him." That is Genesis 5:24. The biblical line is brief, but later tradition expands the story. In 1st Enoch, the quiet figure from Genesis becomes a visionary scribe, shown the heavens, the judgment of rebellious powers, and the end awaiting kings and sinners. According to the manuscript evidence, word Enoch is not one book written all at once. It is a collection. The Book of the Watchers, the Book of Parables, the Astronomical Book, the Dream Visions, the Epistle of Enoch. Different layers, different moments, but together they formed a powerful sacred library around one ancient name. The Manuscript Trail is where this story becomes solid. For centuries, many people in Europe knew one Enoch, mostly by rumor, quotations, and fragments. Then the trail widened. In the Dead Sea Scrolls, discovered near Qumran beginning in 1947, scholars found Aramaic fragments of one Enoch in Cave 4 and other caves. That matters enormously. It means parts of the book were circulating in Jewish circles before the time of Jesus. The Israel Antiquities Authority and generations of scrolls scholars have helped establish that point beyond serious doubt. The manuscript evidence suggests an early textual life in Aramaic, later translated into Greek, and finally preserved most fully in Ge'ez, the classical language of Ethiopia. Greek fragments survive. A notable witness appears in Codex Panopolitanus, sometimes called the Akhmim manuscript, found in Egypt and dating to around the 6th century AD, preserving part of the Book of the Watchers. There are also quotations and echoes in early Christian writers, but the most complete form of 1st Enoch survives in Ethiopic manuscripts. According to the Ethiopian tradition, the text was preserved as part of a wider canon received and transmitted within the Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church. That does not mean every surviving Ethiopian manuscript is early. Many are medieval or later, but they preserve a much older work, and this is where caution matters. The Garima Gospels are among Ethiopia's most famous ancient Christian manuscripts, likely between late antiquity and the early medieval period, but they are gospel books, not copies of 1st Enoch. They help us see the antiquity of Ethiopian Christian manuscript culture. They do not prove one Enoch was always copied in exactly the same form. What survives is not always what was originally written. Still, from Qumran in Aramaic to Egypt in Greek to Ethiopia in Ge'ez, the line of transmission is real. What the text itself says is part of why 1st Enoch was remembered so powerfully. The opening lines announce judgment in language that later readers could hardly miss. Behold, he comes with 10,000s of his holy ones to execute judgment upon all and to destroy all the ungodly. That is 1 Enoch, chapter 9 in most modern translations. If it sounds familiar, it should. The New Testament letter of Jude, verses 14 and 15, quotes it directly. Behold, the Lord comes with 10,000s of his holy ones to execute judgment on all. Jude even names Enoch, the seventh from Adam. So yes, Jude quotes Wars Enoch, or at least a form of this Enochic tradition. This does not prove the whole book was accepted as scripture by all Christians. But it does raise a fascinating question about how early believers read revered texts. The most famous section is the Book of the Watchers. Here the story grows out of Genesis 6, where the Bible briefly mentions the sons of God and the Nephilim. First Enoch expands that shadowy passage into a full drama of angelic rebellion. And Semihaza, who was their leader, said unto them, I fear ye will not indeed agree to do this deed. Soon the watchers descend, take wives, teach forbidden arts, and bring corruption upon the earth. What the text itself says is vivid and severe. It speaks of heavenly beings teaching humanity enchantments, the cutting of roots, weapons making, cosmetics, and occult knowledge. It says the earth was filled with violence. Then judgment comes. In one passage, the fallen angel Asael is condemned. Bind Asael hand and foot and cast him into the darkness. The imagery is harsh. It is meant to explain why the world feels disordered. Evil is not only human, it is cosmic. But First Enoch is not only a book about rebellious watchers, it is also a book about justice. Again and again, it promises that the wicked will not rule forever. The righteous and elect shall rise from the earth, one passage says. Another declares that the Lord of spirits will judge kings and mighty ones who oppress the innocent. For Jewish communities living under foreign power, this was not abstract. It was hope. Then there are the journeys. Enoch is taken through storehouses of wind, stars, mountains of metal, fiery rivers, and places of imprisonment prepared for transgressing powers. In the astronomical book, the text describes the courses of heavenly lights in careful, almost priestly detail. Modern readers can find these sections strange. Ancient readers often found them awe-inspiring. They joined worship, calendar, and cosmos together. Scholars remain divided on some sections, especially the similitudes or parables of Enoch. Were they written before Jesus? After? George Nicholsburg and James Vanderkam have both emphasized the complexity of the book's composition. Richard Bauckham has written carefully on Jude's use of Enochic material. The point is not that every part of First Enoch is simple. It is not. But its great themes are clear: heavenly rebellion, earthly corruption, divine judgment, and the vindication of the righteous. And perhaps that is why the book lingered. Not because it answered every question, but because it gave shape to fears already present in biblical tradition. It took a few verses from Genesis and opened a vast apocalyptic world behind them. So why did one Enoch remain in Ethiopia but not in most canons? First, because influence is not the same as canon. Many ancient Jewish and Christian texts were respected, copied, and quoted without becoming scripture for all communities. Second, First Enoch appears to have fallen out of favor in Rabbinic Judaism, even though it had earlier authority in some Jewish circles. Once the Hebrew Bible solidified in the forms later inherited by Judaism, Enoch was no longer part of that scriptural collection. Among Christians, canon formed gradually and locally before it became more settled. Athanasius, in his festal letter of 367 AD, gave a list of books recognized as canonical for the Church under his influence, and First Enoch was not among them. The councils of Hippo in 393 and Carthage in 397 helped stabilize Latin Christian lists, again without Enoch. Much later, the Council of Trent in 1546 defined the Roman Catholic canon in response to Reformation disputes, and First Enoch was not included there either. That is not evidence of a conspiracy. It is evidence of historical canon formation. The book was ancient. It was influential. But many church leaders judged it outside the rule of Scripture, even while some still knew and valued it. According to the Ethiopian tradition, however, a different canon history endured. In that world, one Enoch remained preserved in tradition, debated in other traditions, forgotten by others. Geography mattered. Language mattered. The survival of Ge'ez Christian literature mattered. A book can vanish in one branch of the church and live on in another. The honest answer is that scholars broadly agree on the big picture, even while details remain disputed. Warned Enoch is an ancient Jewish work or collection of works. Parts of it existed before Christianity. Jude uses Enochic language directly. The complete text survived in Ge'ez because the Ethiopian Orthodox tradition kept copying it. But scholars remain divided on composition, dating of certain sections, and exactly how different communities understood its authority. James Vanderkam has long argued for the book's importance in Second Temple Judaism. Michael Heiser often pointed out how deeply its themes illuminate the supernatural worldview around the New Testament. Bart Ehrman, from a different angle, has also emphasized how diverse early Judaism and Christianity really were. This does not prove that First Enoch should be in every Bible, and it does not reduce it to mere curiosity either. It stands in that difficult place between scripture, tradition, and historical witness. A book quoted by Jude, rooted in ancient Judaism, preserved by Ethiopia, and still, for most Christians, outside the canon. 1. Enoch was not lost because it said too much, nor preserved because it said everything right. It endured because ancient believers found in it an echo of questions the Bible itself had already opened. And as ever with old books and older faith, what survives is not always what was originally written, but sometimes what survives tells us exactly how the past was remembered.